Hello and welcome. I am Natalie Pearson, Curriculum Coordinator at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. Welcome to our Politics in Action event. I'm delighted to be chairing the Philippines session. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the lands on which the University of Sydney is based are Gadigal lands, and that these are lands and waters that were never ceded. I pay my respects to elders past and present who have cared and who continue to care for these lands and these waters. Tonight, I have the privilege of introducing Professor Maria Ela Atienza from the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She's also co-convener of the UP Centre for Integrative and Development Studies program on social and political change. So Ella is going to speak to us for about 15 minutes tonight, giving us an update on the situation in the Philippines over the last 12 months. And that will be followed, as is our standard format, with a Q&A session, which I will moderate. So if you do have questions, please pop them in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You can also join us live on Facebook. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ella and look forward to your update on the Philippines. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalie, and good evening to everyone. It's still good afternoon in the Philippines, particularly in Quezon City, where I live. I'm actually in a room in my house. I've been here since last year when the lockdown was announced in March 2020. So first of all, allow me to thank the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre for inviting me to be the speaker for this year's Philippine Update. And thank you to Liz and Ariane especially for all the help in preparing for this afternoon. In the brief time that I will be speaking, and in order for me to focus on a few important points on politics in the Philippines, I'll be using the framework of constitutional performance assessment methodology, and this is a methodology developed by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Accountability. We used this methodology last year to publish two important documents. First, before the pandemic, Constitutional Performance Assessment of the 1987 Philippine Constitution. And then when the pandemic and the lockdown hit the Philippines, we made it a point to update our findings, and we produced the Constitutional Performance Assessment in the time of a pandemic. Of course, what I'll be presenting to you today, this afternoon, would be more updates on what is happening in the Philippines. The project was conducted by the International IDEA and the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies. I was part of a team that looked at the constitutional performance assessment of the 1987 Constitution, and part of the esteemed group of colleagues I work with are two perhaps familiar with the center, Professors Aris Arugay and Jean Encinas Franco. So we use a qualitative methodology looking at the internal and external criteria in looking at how the 1987 Constitution performed after it was actually drafted. So if we look closely, and if you're familiar with the Philippines, in 1987, we drafted a new constitution that was the result of the toppling of the dictator through a people power in 1986. And we established a presidential and unitary but devolved system of government. So based on the constitutional provisions, how has Philippine politics performed from 1987 to 2019 before the pandemic in terms of achieving its goals? We found out that internally we can only say that there is thin compliance with the internal criteria used in the performance assessment. What does this mean? It means that many of the technical requirements in the Constitution have been achieved because we were able to set up the mandated institutions, we were able to hold processes like elections and enacting some of the necessary laws and actions. However, in terms of thick or substantial compliance, we found out that the performance of the Constitution is still wanting because some laws that were mandated in the Constitution have not yet been enacted. We also noted that there is what we call executive dominance, even if we establish the principle of separation of powers and checks and balances. In terms of external criteria, although notable progress has been made, there is still limited or thin compliance when it comes to promoting substantial democratization, decentralization, social justice, human rights, and gender equality, peace and conflict resolution, and economic development. Then what happened when the pandemic hit the Philippines and a national state of health emergency was imposed in the Philippines in March 2020 up to the present. We using the same constitutional design areas that we followed in our study, I will identify some threats and opportunities in the democratization process in the Philippines. First, in terms of electoral institutions, in 2020, there was delay in voters' registration and holding of a local plebiscite in a province. But we were able to resume this after some months, and the Commission on Elections has achieved a major goal in successfully actually holding a provincial plebiscite even during a pandemic. However, the challenge is that we will have national and local elections in 2022. So the challenge is how to prepare and hold a safe and successful national and local elections in 2022. But at the same time, elections in the Philippines need to be more fair, free, and competitive. In terms of legislative-executive relations, the trend of having a very strong executive continues, and this has been heightened during the pandemic. The executive branch has been too dominant, but instead of using the powers and actually popularity of the president to actually deal with the pandemic and actually deliver on the promises that the president campaigned for in 2016, the office of the president has used this popularity and domination of the executive branch to actually attack different types of critics and opposition instead of actually dealing with the pandemic. The two houses of Congress have also not used to the maximum its accountability and oversight functions over the executive branch. Some controversial decisions of the legislature involve, for instance, passing the Anti-Terrorism Act, as well as giving another franchise to the largest broadcasting network of the Philippines. And these are actually more inclined in terms of the interests of the executive branch. In terms of the judiciary, the two branches of government have actually attacked the independence of the judiciary because the judiciary tried to actually exercise the new powers that it has been given since the 1987 Constitution. Since the past two administrations, the judiciary has definitely weakened, and we can see this in terms of the more careful approaches in terms of dealing with very controversial political issues. Threats and killings of judges, prosecutors, and lawyers have intensified under the Duterte administration. So the challenge for the judiciary now include how to make the current digitization of courts work for greater access of people and more efficiency of the court system, how it will decide on the constitutionality of the Anti-Terrorism Act, and how it will actually defend its integrity and independence vis-a-vis the two other branches of government. In terms of accountability institutions, we have established a number of them, including the Commission on Audit and the Commission on Human Rights. They are definitely pressured by particularly the executive branch, but they are still working, and that's actually good to know. And their role is all the more critical now to check on the powers and actions, particularly of the executive branch, and in terms of actually tracking the huge amount of money given by the legislature for the executive to use for the pandemic response. In terms of local governments, we can see more innovations, more partnerships with different sectors, and more interlocal government and regional coordination since the pandemic. However, there is unequal performance on the part of different local government units because not all local government units have the necessary resources to actually address the pandemic and other challenges. The challenge now for local governments is how they should continue to assert their autonomy, genuine devolution, and regional development vis-a-vis a more top-down style of the national government. And at the same time, also making sure that the local government code or the devolution law has actually achieved its purposes. In terms of rights in the Philippines are not invalidated by the declaration of the state of emergency. However, we have noted more intensified attacks on the right to information, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and other basic freedoms during the pandemic. In particular, the right to health of a lot of people have been denied, and we also saw inequality of treatment. Poor and vulnerable people and opposition groups are often victims of unfair arrests and attacks for curfew and quarantine violations, drug cases, and of course, red tagging of critics, opposition, academics, and progressive groups. In terms of the security sector, the challenge is how to keep the security sector within its constitutional mandate. And there is, until now, poor civilian oversight institutions. The security sector has increased its role in the pandemic response, not only in terms of the enforcement of the pandemic response, but in leading the response because we have a lot of retired military personnel occupying cabinet positions. So instead of having more health and other experts leading the response to the pandemic, we have military and police personnel leading the pandemic response. In terms of economy and labor, the Philippines is now under a recession and unemployment is rising. We have seen increasing vulnerability of specific sectors, but the challenge for our lawmakers is how to really institute economic reforms that will really address the needs of the vulnerable economic sectors. In terms of citizenship and equality, there are two contrasting narratives. The top-down, peace and order or obey or else discourse being promoted by the national government versus efforts on the part of citizens and groups to develop mechanisms for active citizenry and participatory governance on the ground. And we are seeing a lot of partnerships, volunteerism, and genuine bayanihan or helping each other spirit on the ground. So to summarize, what is the situation of Philippine politics during the pandemic? Areas that we have already identified as problematic before in the original assessment are indeed continuing to be so, and even areas where positive performance was recognized in the assessment are being challenged as a result of the pandemic. Despite the challenges, we can see positive innovations in local governments, in the judiciary, and in citizenship areas, and this could provide inspiration for more institutional policies and programs that could improve performance of the key goals of the Constitution, such as decentralization, autonomy, and social justice. However, the future of the amendment process, which was promoted by the current administration as regards the constitution, is currently on hold because of the pandemic. But it's also possible in the short term to focus on the passage of necessary amendments of existing laws, administrative reforms in specific agencies, and stricter implementation of laws already in place to achieve many of the goals of the constitution. And we see that reviewing the Constitution and possible amendments to it can still be pursued after the 2022 elections. And aside from the legal and administrative reforms, there should also be focus on strengthening democratic actors, groups, and practices. But we have to see, because right now a lot of actors are mobilizing already in preparation for the 2022 elections, and hopefully the more democratic actors, despite all these problems, can find a way to try to change the narrative being promoted by the national government, particularly the office of the president. So I end with a picture of the future of the Philippines, which is very important. And I guess this is the battleground. What would be the future for the Philippines? We are at a critical juncture, and I look forward to all your questions. So thank you very much. Salamat po.
Thank you so much, Ella, for that wonderful overview of the situation in the Philippines in the last 12 months and also looking forward. We do have questions coming through. If you haven't yet posed your question, now is your time to do so. You can pop it in the Q&A chat below. So the first question I'd like to come to is it relates to cronyism. And the question is, why hasn't Congress been using its oversight power over the executive? Is this related to cronyism, or is there some other explanation?
Okay, thank you very much for that very important question. One problem why the two houses of Congress have not been exercising a lot of its oversight functions is mainly because we have weak political parties in the Philippines, and at the same time we have weak laws. We do not have laws punishing turncoats. And our elections are still popularity oriented instead of principle oriented or program oriented. So the tendency is, once we elect a new president, most of our legislators will transfer to the party of the president. So it's difficult to really check on the powers of the executive branch when you have allies, a lot of allies in Congress. So that's the reason why there are efforts to try to reform the party system and election laws in the Philippines. But up to now, this has not been very successful.
Thank you. All right, the next question is about independence of the judiciary. The majority of the magistrates in the Philippines Supreme Court are Duterte appointees. What is the impact of this civil-military imbalance on public policy and the state of democracy in the Philippines?
Yes, one particular issue in the Philippines is that right now, majority of the members of the judiciary are already Duterte appointees, and at the same time, also many of them have been in a way pressured to act in accordance with the wishes of the executive branch. So there's a tendency now for members of the court to be very careful rather than very activist, as opposed to the first perhaps the first 2 decades since the 1986 people power. So the worrying thing about the judiciary in the Philippines is that we have quite a number of early retirements. Even the previous Chief Justice has retired earlier than reaching 70 years old, and perhaps these early retirements are a way of trying to get more Duterte appointees in the judiciary. So we are worried that laws that are being challenged now in the judiciary, like the Anti-Terrorism Act, will not get a fair hearing. The hearings are ongoing now, but at the same time also, we're also hoping that, given 37 complaints regarding the Anti-Terrorism Act, that might actually sway the way for the judiciary to move in support of the constitutional principles, and the fact that for the first time, it's very rare for the judiciary to talk about its independence and to actually talk about protecting judges, lawyers, and prosecutors. But this March, it actually came out with a statement actually pushing for the promotion of protecting everyone working within the justice system, and it made the a commitment to focus on reforms that will protect the independence of the judiciary. And we hope that that can still be pushed because the administration will end by 2022. So there might be a new president by 2022.
Of course, the big topic in the Philippines, as elsewhere, is COVID. We have two questions relating to COVID. First is about Duterte's role in responding to COVID and whether there is general happiness within the general public about his COVID response. And then the second question relating to COVID, if I may, is about regional disparities in the capacity to respond to COVID. So maybe if you want to address them at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the comments regarding President Duterte's response to COVID. There were a few surveys that says that above 50% of people are satisfied with how the government has been responding, but it's more difficult now to conduct surveys than before. So we don't know how accurate it is, but given the number of cases, many of the expert analysis of the Duterte response is it has been unsuccessful in terms of contact tracing, strengthening the public healthcare system, and at the same time, of course, ramping up the vaccinations. It has acted too late in many of the responses to COVID, including actually border control. And one worrying aspect of the Duterte response, as I mentioned, is that it has relied so much on retired military and police personnel. So the response is not as if the crisis is health and economic related. It's more peace and order, and that might be the reason why there is a tendency not to listen to experts and grassroots organizations. In terms of regional disparities, it's true, and this is one thing that should be focused. That should get more focus because while many local governments have been trying to respond positively, there are certain regions, provinces, cities, and municipalities that require more assistance because not all local governments are actually equipped, not only in terms of skills, but also in terms of finances to deal with the problem. And this is one problem, even if we are now in the 30th year of the local government code, which empowered local government units to actually assume more responsibilities. The pandemic has actually exposed the inequality in terms of the resources and capacities of local governments and regions to respond to the pandemic.
Thank you, Ella. I think we do have time for one more question, if I may. So again, this is a group of questions relating to constitutional amendments. Yeah. You stated that the Philippines has weak political parties. Does the plan of constitutional amendment include amendations to those political parties?
Yes.
And do you see further reform taking place following the implementation of the Mandanas ruling?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the questions. Definitely part of the package of reforms that actually the Department of Interior and Local Government has been pushing include actually making sure that there could be reforms in the electoral system, in the party system, and that also cover how do we handle political dynasties in the Philippines. But because of the pandemic, definitely many of these recommendations are on hold. But we're hoping that if COVID has been managed, we can go back to many of these possible amendments in the Constitution. Regarding the Mandanas ruling, definitely the amount of money that will be transferred to local government units will increase by 2022 if, of course, the national budget is ready to transfer this. But that's how the Supreme Court and the Department of Budget and Management actually planned the implementation of the Mandanas ruling. However, I think this will have to be accompanied by amendments also in the 1991 Local Government Code, because right now the shares of local governments are still skewed toward cities and other local government units that actually have the capacity to raise their own incomes. And so you have the poor, smaller populated LGUs who actually need more assistance, but they don't get enough based on the current formula. So I guess it's important, of course, to give more resources to local government units in general, but we also have to accompany these with more equitable distribution. So that means amendment, not perhaps in the Constitution, but also in the local government code. But at the same time, also, there should also be more incentives for good performance in local government. Thank you.
Ella, we're really making you work hard here. I think I'm cutting it fine, but I think we do have time for one more question.
Okay, sure. That's okay. I like the questions.
I'm going to limit you to a minute and a half. Okay. So the question is, could you comment on the Philippines' position with regards to China and the US?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. Sorry, because of the lack of time, I was not able to discuss that during the presentation. Of course, the Duterte administration has this hedging policy from the very beginning, but it's turning out to be a sore thumb right now on the part of the Duterte administration, because it is being put to task by a lot of people regarding its stance on the West Philippine Sea and the relationship with China. And now the Duterte administration is on the defensive, saying that he did not promise that he will fight for the Philippine rights in the disputed territories. But we have evidence, actually, that he really campaigned on that particular promise. And so we are seeing now the backtracking in terms of his style. And I think right now, this could be one area that can be an important electoral issue in 2022. His failure, not only the COVID response, but his failure to actually protect not just the territory of the Philippines, but our fisher folks who are often threatened by Chinese forces in the disputed territories.
Well, we certainly covered a lot of ground in just half an hour. Thank you very much, Ella, for sharing your insights and knowledge with us. It was a delight to have you as our guest at the 2021 Politics in Action. So thank you so much. We look forward to hearing more about your research over the next 12 months as well. And for those who've dialed in, our next and final session will be focusing on Thailand with Professor Duncan McCargo, chaired by Professor Michelle Ford from the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. So we'll see you there in a couple of minutes. And once again, Ella, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, and thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure.